Literacy Consultant at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction.
And I'm Barb Novak, Literacy Consultant at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction.
Welcome to the next in our Literacy Live 2013-2014 webinar series, Balancing Prevention and Intervention. Today's webinar is going to focus on structuring intervention. So just as a reminder, this is the graphic that represents the vision for our connected webinar series. Remember that right now we're still focusing on the intervention half of this kind of balancing line. And the goal for today's webinar is to learn about a variety of processes and models for structuring intervention. Guiding questions such as where does it fit in daily schedules? How does it interact with universal instruction? And what framework for instruction is utilized will be addressed. So these right here are our guiding questions for intervention. And the first point that we really want to make here is the fact that interventions always need to be above and beyond core instruction. That being said, though, we also need to think about interventions that you can provide within the core classroom. So when we're thinking about that, we see it there on the left-hand side of the chart. We want to be answering questions like, how does your instructional framework allow for intervention within the core classroom? And how much time is allocated daily for universal instruction? When we're thinking specifically about interventions beyond the core classroom, we again want to focus on what kind of a framework is used for intervention instruction. And how does this relate to universal instruction? Where do you find or create time for intervention beyond universal instruction? And we know that that is really a key question for most school districts. So first we're going to talk a little bit about an evidence-based instructional framework. And this is the gradual release of responsibility. And you can see here that the resources on ELA instruction can be found in at that link that's at the top of the slide there. And that link really provides you a lot of in-depth details about an instructional framework that is, as I said, evidence-based. The gradual release of responsibility framework is broken up or divided into 4 different components. The first is the focus lesson. The second is guided instruction. The third is collaborative, and the fourth is independent. Although I really shouldn't use those numbers, because the one point I really want to emphasize here is that gradual release of responsibility is a flexible model. You don't have to do it in this order that's presented or that you may seem to see on your screen. You could, for example, jump right in and begin a lesson with that collaborative piece, that piece where you pose some kind of a problem to students and they're trying to work out how to do it together. You could also jump right into guided instruction, and so the teacher and the students are working on some kind of a problem together. One of the things that's particularly effective about this instructional framework is that there's space within it to deliver or provide intervention. So the focus lesson is based on a grade level Common Core state standard. All students at a particular grade level have access to the same material, the same standard, but within the guided instruction, the collaborative work, and the independent practice, the work can really be differentiated so that students are receiving, in addition to practice and instruction on grade level standards, they're receiving interventions that meet their individual needs. And I think we also want to stop and think about the fact that there may be other instructional frameworks out there that actually operate very similarly to this model. For example, we were just at a professional learning experience where they were talking about a workshop model. Their figure was a circle instead of 2 triangles that were side by side, but we really saw the same elements within that circle. So as a reminder, we're going to share some stories with you today from some different school districts from around Wisconsin. And we are respecting the confidentiality of the schools and the districts. Remember that these stories represent particular schools' journey along the continuum of implementing an RTI system or a multi-level system of support. Remember that it takes bravery to share. Nobody likes standing up in front of the class and delivering a speech,
or even just talking to a computer in an empty campus room.
Exactly. And so example of today is going to come from the Wausau School District, and this is really going to be a K-5 example. So Wausau begins with this idea of a comprehensive literacy framework. We're talking about core instruction right now. And the vision for their core instruction is to provide high-quality, differentiated core curriculum and behavioral instruction. And I like that we see here that kind of marrying of the academics and the behaviors, DBIS. So their goal is to provide standards-based instruction, and they do that through both a reading workshop and writing workshop model. And so we can see here some of the elements that would lend themselves to that gradual release of responsibility instructional framework. A whole group mini lesson, some small group instruction, individual conferences, independent work, whole group sharing, and word study. And so right away we can see that if this is how they're structuring their core instruction, if this is their framework for that, again, there are definitely opportunities here to provide some additional supports to students right within that core instruction. And so what does a day in a Wausau school actually look like? What you see on the screen here is an example of one building schedule from one elementary school in Wausau. Each building schedule does look slightly different. The Wausau School District worked in the 2012-2013 school year with Michael Rettig in order to customize schedules and build in an intervention enrichment period, 40 minutes for every day for all students. So just taking a look at this schedule, we can see some coding here, and you may be able to guess LA refers to language arts, that R refers to recess, math, the IE, of course, is intervention and enhancement. That encore block refers to kind of a combination. It could be gym, music, phy-ed, your specials, some school districts call them. The SS is social studies. The SC is science. And lunch, of course, is lunch. So again, this is just one example of what one school district has done in order to provide interventions and additional challenges to those students who need those. And so here's what a typical day of language arts instruction might look like in a Wausau school. So the day begins, they have kind of a whole class gathering, kind of your housekeeping, taking attendance, and then beginning with some kind of textual work. The example here might be a poem. And then we go into a focus lesson, and that might be comprehension with a picture book. And again, that may change depending on the grade level that we're actually talking about. And then we have, they call it round one, and this is kind of the first opportunity for small group work to take place. And so we see here the teacher works with a small group and then confers with 3 to 4 students. The teacher brings back the whole class for another focus lesson, this one on accuracy, and then around 2, another opportunity. And this time the teacher works with small group, confers with 3 to 4 students. And notice we have a notation here about this is where for one particular teacher, a paraprofessional or other support staff might be in the room. So clearly a model here of push-in versus a pull-out, and some opportunity to provide some targeted additional support to those students who've been identified as needing them. And then coming back together for a share or a review of strategies, adding to the anchor chart, and then moving into writer's workshop. And so this, again, is just one example of what one school district has done to structure their core instruction that at the same time allows for some interventions or additional challenges to take place. So this right here that you're seeing is a template that, again, was created by a teacher in the Wausau School District. And so this would guide any classroom teacher in really planning what's going to happen during those small group opportunity times. And where it says group or individual, the teacher can determine if he or she would meet with a group during that time period or with individuals in that group for some independent one-on-one conferencing. And we see here that there are only 4 groups that are listed on this template because Wausau encourages no more than 4 groups per classroom. Many students move between classrooms during core instruction in order to optimize the number of groups per teacher, allowing more time per group, and also making sure that the students that are most in need of additional interventions or challenges have the opportunity to meet with the educator who's most highly qualified in the school as well.
So we're really using this word workshop to refer to something that's really carefully planned. Focused lessons based on grade level standards, small group instruction, conferencing based on, again, grade level standards and data that the teachers collected, ongoing data that the teachers collecting about the students.
Absolutely. And when we're talking about small group time, again, as Barb said, that's always very carefully planned. So even if students are working in small groups with other students, that was very carefully planned and structured. They have a very clear focus, what they're doing there to address grade level standards.
So the next example that we want to share with you is from another K-5 example, this time from the Oshkosh area school district. So let's look first at the model that Oshkosh is using for universal instruction. Although the graphic is different than how Wausau is representing their workshop, Oshkosh is also using a literacy workshop model. So on the top of the screen, you see whole group instruction. That's where their workshop begins. The lesson might utilize a read aloud, might utilize shared reading, might utilize shared writing, might involve the teacher think aloud, but students are gaining access at that point in the lesson to grade level standards and grade level materials. The next portion of those workshop blocks is represented by those 3 arrows in the middle of your screen: one-on-one instruction, small group instruction, and students being engaged in independent practice. Again, there's intervention happening during this time. The teacher deliberately chooses the students that he or she conferences with on a given day and deliberately selects the students for reading and writing groups and strategy and skill groups based on specific needs of students and based on their understanding of the grade level standards. At the end of the workshop time, the class comes back together to do a whole group share that connects back to that original mini lesson or focus lesson from the beginning of the workshop. The next thing that Oshkosh shared with us is the continuum of support that they've designed in the area of literacy. So what you see in the color coding that's on this slide is going to correlate with the color coding on the next few slides. So Oshkosh has designed 5 different degrees of support. So at the universal level in light blue, you have universal instruction for all students, and in a minute we'll look at the expectations and the evidence. Then you have additional effective classroom-based strategies for some students. So those would be some interventions or challenges that are delivered as part of universal instruction by the classroom teacher. And again, there's expectations, evidence, and a little bit of progress monitoring going on. Then there's structured low intensity interventions. So as you move down the chart, students' needs are slowly getting greater, slowly intensifying, and you see that the levels of support are slowly intensifying. You always have expectations and evidence. As you move down the continuum, you start to enter into recommended interventions and recommended strategies for progress monitoring. And in our next webinar, we'll go into a little bit more about what those recommended interventions and progress monitoring tools are. One of the things that I think is particularly unique about this system is that it's not showing us the typical RTI triangle or the typical system of just 3 tiers. They're actually recognizing additional tiers above and beyond universal, selected, and targeted.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that's one thing that's very interesting about their continuum of support and how they represent that continuum of support.
So what you see on your screen now is specific to that purple line that you saw on the previous slide, additional effective classroom-based strategies for some students. So these are strategies that are being utilized within the workshop framework by the classroom classroom teacher for those students who need intervention or challenges. You see expectations, you see evidence, and you see progress monitoring. So one of the expectations might be that the small group and one-on-one instruction for students who aren't meeting benchmarks yet might be a little bit more frequent than for students who are meeting benchmarks. It might be a little bit more focused. It might be a little bit longer in duration than what students who are meeting benchmarks are engaging in. Evidence is what you see within a classroom. One thing is that the classroom teacher might be providing targeted word work instruction as part of the guided reading lesson. So word work is definitely part of the whole group routine, but it might also be incorporated into the guided reading routine for those students who need additional work in that area. And you also see some progress monitoring tools. And we'll really go into the evidence and the progress monitoring more in our next webinar. Let me go ahead, Laura.
Oh, I was just going to say, and again, this is an example that really allows for more of a push out versus a or a push in versus a pull out model. And again, so we don't necessarily see an exact block of intervention or enhancement time in an Oshkosh schedule, but they've still found a way to provide that in their daily schedule.
Yeah, I think that's an important difference to note between the choices that Wausau made and the choices that Oshkosh has made. One district chooses to add that intervention enrichment block, and the other district chooses to deliver their services in another way. It's just a matter of deciding what fits with your district's beliefs and values and expectations for students. So here's one more example of a line from Oshkosh's Continuum of Support and Literacy kind of blown out for you. This is for students who need just a little bit more support, structured to moderate intensity interventions, and this is completely in addition to universal instruction and classroom intervention. So students who are working at this level would be getting universal instruction plus some interventions from their classroom teacher as part of their literacy block, plus this additional structured moderate intensity intervention. So the next example that we want to share with you actually takes us up to the high school level, 9-12, and this is an example from the Menasha Joint School District. So Menasha is in their first year of officially delivering literacy interventions in addition to universal instruction in the way that we're describing it here today for you. So the first thing to think about is that Menasha has done some work around adopting a universal framework for instruction in all disciplines. They're in the very early stages of talking with all teachers in all content areas about what gradual release of responsibility might look like within their content area. One of the things that they discovered during their work last year was that students need to be reading on a regular basis in order to become better as readers. Students need to be practicing. And looking at some of the data from their building, there wasn't necessarily a lot of time provided for students to practice reading. So this gradual release of responsibility framework is one way that they're able to build in some of that practice in a very structured and very purposeful way during their school day. So besides just thinking about universal instruction as besides just thinking about gradual release of responsibility as a framework for universal instruction, Menasha also added a reading intervention time during their school day. So this is a class, a reading intervention class that students are scheduled into. The class meets in addition to core instruction. They run a regular 7-period day in their high school. So this is a class that students are registered for during one of their 7 periods. It does replace an elective for students. We showed you Menasha's data-based identification process in our second webinar. So you can see that process that they use to target students. And once they get students scheduled into the reading intervention, it actually uses a workshop framework specifically focused on gradual release of responsibility. So you'll see a focus lesson, you'll see guided instruction, you'll see collaborative practice, you'll see the teacher meeting with small groups, you'll see the teacher conferencing individually with students. So they're mirroring that instructional framework in both universal instruction and intervention. And I think one thing that's important to note here is that it's a difficult choice when you're thinking about how to schedule students for reading intervention in middle school or reading intervention in high school. it's really difficult to think about where that time is going to come from. And you want students to be engaged in the intervention when they're part of that class. So being really sensitive to students' feelings about what they have to give up in order to be involved in that intervention, and really taking the time to build relationships with kids and build relationships with their families so that students see why this is a meaningful choice for them.
Absolutely. And one thing that occurred to me, going back to this idea of having an instructional framework in all disciplines, one thing that we often hear from our math colleagues is that they have their own instructional framework in mathematics courses. Sometimes that's referred to as LESA, L-E-S-A. Here at the Department of Public Instruction, we refer to it as LESRA, L-E-S-R-A. We added kind of this reflect piece into that framework. And that framework really does work with the gradual release of responsibility framework. There are a lot of similarities there. But I think just kind of that idea, just to be aware that mathematics folks especially, that LESA or LESRA framework may resonate more with them than this idea of a gradual release of responsibility framework. But the two are definitely very, very well integrated. They can work well with each other. So today we took a look at the structure of interventions. We talked about structure of interventions both within the core classroom and beyond the core classroom. So coming back to our guiding questions within the core classroom, how does your instructional framework allow for intervention within the core classroom? And how much time is allocated daily for universal instruction? The key questions we addressed in thinking about interventions beyond the core classroom were what framework is used for intervention instruction, because it's equally important to have an instructional framework for your interventions as well. How does this relate to the universal instruction? Where do you find or create the time for intervention beyond universal instruction? The next webinar in the series is going to address those questions in those bottom boxes there. What tools or resources are utilized for intervention, both within the core classroom and beyond universal instruction? So the goal for our next webinar is to learn about tools or resources that are utilized for intervention, such as diagnostic tools. We're going to be making some connections to the Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts, because everything should always be standards-based. We're going to talk a little bit about purchased interventions and district-designed interventions as well. So here are some places where you can find more information on some of the things that we've referenced during our webinar today. So just as a reminder, resources on English Language Arts instruction are in that top hyperlink. I definitely encourage those of you who work in Title I schools, who are working closely with your Title I director, to check out our Title I specific resources, because of course there are some extra rules and regulations around providing interventions when we're talking about a Title I program. And of course we have some differences between targeted assistance and school-wide Title I programming. We definitely encourage you to check out all the great resources that you can find around a multi-level system of support at the Wisconsin RTI Center. And to see other modules of professional learning, you can visit that last hyperlink there for our professional learning on demand.
And don't forget to follow us on Twitter, where we're always sharing the latest and greatest news about Common Core State Standards and literacy in Wisconsin.
Here's our contact information. Please feel free to contact us anytime. And thanks for joining us. We will see you next time.
Thank you.